by hijacked aircraft. Well, it took just one morning to change the world forever. A series of stunning attacks on the most powerful nation on earth. Here's the CBC's Brian Stewart with a detailed look at 2 hours of terror.
Early morning rush hour. Thousands of New Yorkers battle morning traffic to make it to their jobs within the twin 110-story north and south towers of the World Trade Center. Though a terrorist target 8 years ago, at the Trade Center, 50,000 are expected in its offices. Today, there's no special alert or sense of menace. To the north, at Boston Airport, just 1 minute before 8, American Airlines Flight 11 takes off headed for Los Angeles. It's a Boeing 767 carrying 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, 2 pilots. All seems normal as it crosses Newark and climbs to 10,000 meters over the Adirondacks. But suddenly, air traffic controllers see it veer off course and start heading for New York. For the next 30 minutes, alarm controllers watch an apparently hijacked plane streaking towards Manhattan. Then within minutes, they see a second plane, United Airlines Flight 175 with 56 aboard, also veering off course, aiming for Manhattan. At 8:45, all hell breaks loose above New York. The first plane, Flight 11, crash dives straight into the North Tower of the Trade Center, causing catastrophic loss of life. 18 minutes later, at 9:03, a stunned city sees the second plane swoop unerringly into the side of the South Tower, a scene which stuns the world. Even as this is happening, there's more on the way. In Washington's Dulles Airport, Flight 77, a Boeing 757, takes off for Los Angeles, suddenly veers off direction, and at 9:38, crashes at the West Wing of the Pentagon, the very command center of America's military. Minute by minute, horrors mount. 10 a.m., the unthinkable. In New York, the entire South Tower of the Trade Center collapses, like a giant avalanche of concrete and steel, burying so many wounded and rescue workers. 10:10 in the morning. United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 with 45 on board, traveling from Newark to San Francisco, plows into a field disintegrating in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. There are reports of an explosion just before the crash. Then at 10:29, the drumbeat of calamity reaches its peak. Incredibly, the North Tower of the Trade Center also collapses. An event so stunning, so threatening, that much of Manhattan is evacuated. In just 2.5 hours this morning, from the first takeoff in Boston to the tower collapse, America and the world have changed in ways still uncountable and incalculable.
Brian Stewart's look back at what we've witnessed so far today. An incredible day. Let's go to New York City now. Steve Irwin, journalist Steve Irwin, who has been working with us throughout today, helping us out again now. Steve, we're probably just an hour away from darkness starting to descend on New York City. You've been there in the midst of it all today. Your thoughts now?
Peter, it's been... Well, I've been in Manhattan living for a year now, and I was going to say it's been the strangest day of the year, but it certainly has been one of the strangest days of my life. I came downtown towards the World Trade Center just shortly after the first plane went in. I arrived there on bicycle because it was the only way to get around Manhattan today, just after the second tower collapsed. It was a surreal journey, to say the least. On the way down, police had already cordoned off the main thoroughfare on the east side, which is 2nd Avenue, and a phalanx of police cars, ambulance, and rescue vehicles were headed down. It was a column of vehicles as long as the eye could see, and something I have never seen in North America. We're used to these things in other parts of the world, but when it hits home, it it really takes the wind out of you. And I think that was a feeling of most people as I traveled down to the World Trade Center this morning. People couldn't really believe what had happened, and when it hit home, it was a shock. As I passed by Bellevue Hospital, which was taking many of the victims of this attack, which was actually overcrowded by the time I got there shortly after, nurses and doctors were running out, begging passing motorists to take them downtown to the actual site of this disaster so they could help people. By the time I got down there, police were already evacuating the lower end of Manhattan. U.S. Marshals were in with automatic rifles, standing guard. Everyone was trying to help out, but there was a real sense of paranoia because nobody knew if another blast was going to come. It seemed we took one after another this morning, and things just escalated from bad to nightmarish. By the time I got there, I met one hospital volunteer who had come down on his day off to help out. He was in shock and shaking. He said to me, "I came down to help, but the first thing I saw was a man with no head. How do I help?" And I think that was the question on many people's mind. What can you do in the light of this? I talked to one police officer who had chalk on his face. He looked like a ghost from the dust, the tons of dust that settled down on Manhattan from these explosions. He had tears running down his cheek, leaving these bizarre rivulets as he spoke to me, saying that he'd run into the second tower after the first had collapsed to help out, and moments later that one was collapsing as well. He got out, but through his tears he told me that he had lost friends and colleagues in that collapse. People were sitting around here in shock on the sidewalks, phoning loved ones on their cell phones. The phone lines were tied up so they couldn't get through to people to find out if their wives, their daughters, their sons and husbands who had gone to work this morning, like so many tens of thousands had at the World Trade Center, had actually survived this blast. By late afternoon, a very eerie stillness had settled onto Manhattan, which you can still experience right now. If I look down below me, many floors into the streets of Manhattan, they're virtually deserted. Something in this town you never, ever see. People are trying to get out of the city, and the bridges are closed. So what you see is an exodus, much like we'd see in places like Macedonia when many refugees were crossing over. You see lines of people on the bridge by the thousands just walking out of Manhattan into the surrounding boroughs. It's been a very strange and a very sad day here, and I think it's just now settling in for me as a reporter what really did happen here this morning. And I can't speak for other New Yorkers, but that's the sense I get. It's really hitting home. For a long time, throughout the day, it was like a movie. No one could really believe what happened. But now, as the body count starts coming in, people are getting a sense that, yes, this is very real.
And everybody, Steve, is afraid to talk of where that count may lead to, just given the incredible numbers of people who work and were in that immediate area when all this took place.
Peter, nobody's actually come out with a hard number, and you're right, no one will even venture a guess. The mayor was on television earlier today saying it will be at least till tomorrow before we have any fix, even a rough count of what's happening. But he said a very telling statement for a mayor who's generally quite boisterous and aggressive. He said to New Yorkers, whoever you pray to, if it's anyone, pray to them today and ask that we can find a way to get through this together.
You've painted an incredible word picture for us of what that day has been like. It's awfully hard to try to imagine what it's like in that immediate area now. Much of it, as you say, has been evacuated, and only rescue and crews in that area. But it must be awfully hard for them to work because buildings are still collapsing. Another 40, almost 50-story building collapsed a couple of hours ago. They're now saying the Marriott Hotel, which was quite close to the Trade Center, is also in serious danger of collapsing as well. What do we know about what's happening in that southern end of Manhattan? Who is there? Obviously, we're not allowed anywhere near that area, but what do we know about what's going on in that immediate area now?
Well, for sure, I know that every single firefighter, and every single police officer in this city and the surrounding area has been called in. Nobody is taking the day off, or if they were off, they've been summoned in. I've seen police officers actually driving in pajamas earlier today. They are taxed to the maximum. As you can imagine, the carnage down there is unbelievable. Reportedly, just 5-6 stories of rubble, and they're picking through it desperately. The Governor Pataki has called in the National Guard, and they're expected to are arriving now in the thousands. They're expecting 2,000 in here within a matter of hours to relieve some of these emergency workers who are down there now and have been laboring since early this morning. It's expected, I've heard, up to 15,000 National Guard will be here. The mayor said, don't panic. This is nothing to be frightened of. These people are here to help out New Yorkers. So the people who are on the ground now, sifting through that rubble, getting workers or getting victims to hospitals, are in much need of some relief, and that relief is coming in the form of the National Guard. As far as hospitals are concerned, there's been a desperate cry out for blood for donors, but I think they've eased off on that a bit now. Apparently, doctors and nurses are near collapse. It's been like a war zone. The number of people they've come in, and the depth of the trauma that these people are experiencing, obviously physically, but emotionally as well. There's all sorts of counselors that have been called in to deal with the psychological scars these people are just starting to develop.
You know, you mentioned a good point about the medical emergency teams, the response teams who must be trying to, desperately deal with this kind of a situation. At a certain point, they are going to drop just from mere exhaustion. It has been reported that emergency teams from not only across the United States, but across Canada as well, are offering their help. There have been all kinds of reports from across this nation of people offering to donate blood. So we'll see where that story continues to unfold. But Steve, we really appreciate your expertise on this story tonight and your analysis of what's been going on. It's a day obviously like no other in New York City, and it's about to be a night like no other as well. Steve Irwin reporting to us tonight from New York. Well, we still don't know who was behind today's atrocities or where they were planned, but we do know that in the recent past, Canada has been used as a base for attempted terrorist attacks on the United States. And as the CBC's Terence McKenna reports, counterterrorism agencies around the world have been combing through the clues of previous attacks to try to prevent events like those that happened today.
The most haunting foreshadowing of today's terror attack happened in Marseille, France in 1994. French commandos stormed an Air France jet which had been hijacked by Algerian Islamic militants. All the hijackers were killed. 159 hostages were freed. 7 had been killed. French authorities said the hijackers wanted to crash the plane fully loaded with fuel into Paris, if possible, into the Eiffel Tower. The trail from that case led French investigating magistrate Jean-Louis Bruguière to uncover a worldwide network of Islamic terrorists. His work has brought him to Canada and the United States.
This cell is spreading over the world like a web, So it's very difficult to grasp this new threat. But it's very, very dangerous because their target is very different. They try to target not only France, but America.
French investigators established links that led from the 1994 hijacking through the Paris subway bombs in 1995 and 96. And the trail eventually led them to a group of terrorists in Montreal, which included Ahmed Ressam, the man arrested at the American border with powerful explosives in the trunk of his car in 1999. Why would Islamic terrorists come to Canada? David Harris is former Chief of Strategic Planning at the Canadian Security and Intelligence Agency.
I think in terms of Islamic extremists in Canada, they regard the proximity of Canada to the U.S. as making Canada a kind of Islamic extremist aircraft carrier for the launching of major assaults against the U.S. mainland. And that's something we've got to remember.
Congresswoman Jane Harman served on the U.S. Counterterrorism Intelligence Committee.
What is very worrisome is the goals of terrorists have changed. It used to be that terrorists would try to kill a few people and make a political point. But as we stated in this terrorism report that I worked on last year, the goal no longer is a seat at the table. The goal is to blow up the table.
Peter, you know, I've talked to a lot of American intelligence officials and people who have been concentrating on the terrorist file. Many of them have been pointing the fingers at Canada. And I think, you know, a lot of them were calling for more stringent controls on our immigration and refugee procedures because, you know, Ahmed Rassam came into Canada, took advantage of our immigration and refugee situation, got himself a false Canadian passport, got over to Afghanistan to train in Osama bin Laden's terrorist training camps, and came back to plan his attack. And there was already a lot of attention towards what they consider very lax immigration and refugee rules in Canada, and a lot of pressure in Canada to make those much more stringent. And I think, you know, we have no indication yet that any of these terrorists involved today had any connection to Canada. But in times like this, the Americans look to their neighbors to get much more stringent and help them in this situation.
Well, as you say, you've been talking to a lot of these people because you're working on a major documentary that's looking at the use of Canada as a base for terrorist attacks on the U.S. What have you learned in all those discussions that you've been having that might shed some light on what happened today?
Well, you know, there's no question that when Mr. Rassam came to Canada, then he got himself a Canadian passport and went to the Osama bin Laden camp. Osama bin Laden, according to the evidence presented in the trials we've seen in the United States in the last few months, including not just Mr. Rassam, but several others from Canada who have been extradited to the United States and tried there. There was evidence that Mr. bin Laden issued this
Terrence, I got to stop you for a moment. I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you like this, but we're going to go back to Washington. John Ashcroft, the U.S. Attorney General, has just appeared before the microphones. Another statement from a leading figure of the American administration. Let's hear what he has to say.
Our prayers for victims and for their families, for the rescue workers, for law enforcement officials, for every one of us that has been changed forever by this horrible tragedy. The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families. Thousands of FBI agents in all of the field offices across the country and in the international Legat offices, assisted by personnel from other Department of Justice agencies, are cooperating in this investigation. The FBI has established a website where people can report any information about these crimes. That address is www.ifccfbi.gov. That address again, www.ifccfbi.gov. Individuals can report any information they know about these crimes to that website. It takes courage for individuals to come forward in situations like this, and I urge anyone with information that may be useful and helpful to authorities to use this opportunity. The Office of Victims of Crime has established a toll-free 800 number for family and friends of victims. They can call 800-331-0075 to leave contact information for a future time when more information is available, to find out information about a victim, or to find out information about the rights of victims and the services available to victim survivors and victim families. The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American people. We are survivors, and freedom is a survivor. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done. Tommy.
Every single American lost something today. And every one of us at this time expresses our deepest sympathy to the victims of today's tragedies and their families. It is now our mission to begin the healing from this tragedy. From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City, and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs. We've also sent 4 disaster mortuary operational response teams to New York and 3 to the greater Washington area. We're also in the process of shipping a great deal of emergency medical supplies to New York City with the help of the Centers for Disease Control. In short, we're making the full force of the Department of Health and Human Services, both its resources and medical expertise available to the areas that need our assistance. We've also this afternoon activated the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, which consists of approximately 6,000 health professionals. We also are giving backup assistance to the 500-bed ship Comfort from the United States Navy. Americans all over are calling up and asking what they can do. The best thing they can do is respond to this great call by volunteering to give blood. We need Americans to continue to answer that call. No matter where you live, please do your civic duty and assist us by donating blood. It is our primary job is to make sure Americans harmed by this tragedy get the help that they need. We will remain in constant contact with the governors, the mayors, public health officials, and other local officials to make sure that all their needs are being met. It is a sad day, but America and all of its citizens certainly share tonight in the grief that has been caused. And as the President and everybody in his administration have said, we, the government, will continue to operate and continue to provide the services to all Americans.
One of the most cherished freedoms is the freedom of movement, the ability to move freely and safely. But today that freedom was attacked. But we will restore that freedom throughout the national transportation system as soon as possible. And we will restore the highest possible degree of service. These terrorist acts are designed to steal the confidence of Americans. We will restore that confidence. We have already taken some first steps as a precaution. I have ordered the FAA to ground all commercial air traffic until at least tomorrow afternoon. After the attack, some of our aircraft were diverted to Canada, and so we owe our Canadian neighbors a debt of gratitude for helping us as we redirected over 120 flights and their passengers to airports in Canada. As of 6 p.m., Amtrak resumed its passenger rail service. Major railroads have taken steps to protect their assets as well. The United States Coast Guard is taking all necessary actions to control the movements of all vessels in navigable waters.
All right, well, that briefing is going on from the Transportation Secretary, the Attorney General of the United States, and the Health Secretary across town outside the Capitol building. Leaders of the congressional caucuses from both the Republican and the Democratic side are speaking. Let's listen in here. This is the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert.
We have our suspicions. And when that is justified and when those suspicions are justified, we will act. We will stand with the president, we will stand with this government, and we will stand as Americans together through this time. Thank you.
Pause on the politicians for one another, almost willing themselves to stand shoulder to shoulder in a nonpartisan way. This is Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader of the Senate.
Acts were an assault on our people and on our freedom. As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts. Congress will convene tomorrow. And we will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice. We, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, stand strongly united behind the President and will work together to ensure that the full resources of the government are brought to bear in these efforts. Our heartfelt thoughts and our fervent prayers are with the injured and the families of those who have been lost. We know as a nation, as we said, our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
Obviously, we've just lost that line from outside Washington, but at times like this, as we know in the United States from past actions of a terrorist nature, although we have to keep repeating, there's never been a time quite like this with the kind of attack that took place today. But in circumstances that have been similar in a way to this, the Americans speak with one voice, as they were there today, Democrats and Republicans behind the president in whatever action he takes. There have been briefings going on for the last couple of hours for congressional leaders, of which all of those three gentlemen from both the Democratic and Republican caucuses have been taking part in. We have been trying to piece together some of the information based on the public briefings that have been given in the last hour from the Attorney General and from the Health Secretary and also from the Defense Secretary. Still very sketchy on the detail front in terms of what exactly they know about what happened today, apart from the obvious that we've all witnessed on television about how it happened, why it happened, and who's responsible. Still, those kind of that kind of information is still just at the very minor stages in terms of what is being made public. But the resolve on the part of American officials that there will be retaliation and severe retaliation for what happened today does seem to be clear. John Thompson joins us again now. He's been working with us throughout this day. He's an expert on security at the Mackenzie Institute in Toronto. John, one of the first things that I noticed from that last briefing on the part of the Attorney General, the first confirmed indication of what kind of weapon was on board at least one of the aircraft, and that was a knife. Some of the reports have indicated that knife may have been a very small one, the kind of thing that you can pick up at any kind of office supply store, the kind of X-Acto kind of knife, something that could cut through tape, or is usually used for something like that, but obviously used for something much more sinister on a day like this, in other words, commandeering an aircraft.
Well, it's not unusual for knives to be used in hijacking. It used to be more commonly than firearms, especially back in the 70s. And again, modern detection equipment is normally pretty good at picking up a knife as well as a firearm. So it's still surprising that knives got on the aircraft.
Now, it's been a long day. We've heard a lot of information. Some of it we've been able to confirm. A lot of the rest of it still sort of out there in the land of rumor and suspicion. But given what we do know, does one have to assume that this was an incredible failure on the part of the U.S. intelligence system, that it seemed to be totally unaware of this kind of a massive attack that was about to be leveled against that country?
No, I wouldn't say that. Part of the problem with terrorism is what's called an asymmetrical relationship. The terrorist has all the targets he cares to choose. He can pick the time and the method of attack according to his resources, where people who are threatened by terrorism have to try and defend all the possible targets all the time. I mean, it's almost impossible to predict when and where a terrorist will strike. In the case of the leading suspect in this case, Osama bin Laden, although that's by no means confirmed yet, there's been a whole cascade of threat warnings that he might be up to something. But, I mean, what this time? An embassy in another country, a warship in some Asian or African port? He's attacked a lot of different things in the past, and the Americans couldn't anticipate an attack of this magnitude this close to home.
As you suggest, many people seem to have him at the top of the list of potential suspects. Anything that you've heard today make you sway your opinion in that regard?
Well, I couldn't make my mind up either. Part of the attack seems to suggest that he's behind it. Again, there's this sort of complete contempt for human life that is indicative of attacks behind his network before. You look at the embassy bombings in Africa that injured 4,000 people, the blowing up of a barracks in Saudi Arabia, or the first World Trade Center bombing. But at the same time, his network has never really used that many suicide bombers. In fact, I think their first suicide attack was on an American warship last year. The other thing is that this attack was really well planned and well timed, and I think perhaps even by a military staff officer might have had a hand in planning it. And that's not been typical for him either. It's been one attack, one set of casualties, not a whole phased series of coordinated attacks like this.
Given the magnitude and the coordination of this particular attack, what kind of response can we expect once they know with some degree of certainty who was responsible?
Well, make no mistake, this attack at this point in time is probably the single most lethal incident in the entire history of the United States. As a country, they have never lost this many people or suffered this much damage ever in one day. This attack is probably going to produce casualties that would be commensurate with the use of a nuclear weapon or weapons of mass destruction by a terrorist group. Scenarios for the use of an atom bomb often involve the World Trade Center. The American response is probably going to be whatever they feel is appropriate, even up to and perhaps including the use of a tactical nuclear weapon.
No, you're not serious.
I'm quite serious. There may be 25,000 people dead inside those buildings. At the same time, it might be even easier to do something like that than to drop in the 82nd Airborne in the middle of Afghanistan, or to bring in a whole corps of heavy conventional troops to Kuwait and move on Saddam Hussein if that was the case.
But the consequences of taking an action like that, in spite of the horror of what we've witnessed today.
Well, in this case, I mean, this is not merely an incident of terrorism. This has gone way beyond the bounds of terrorism. This is something that far exceeds any terrorist attack that has ever occurred. And the United States is well within its rights as a sovereign nation to take whatever reaction it deems appropriate. That having been said, it's also incumbent on the United States to clearly identify unequivocally who is responsible for this attack and to go after them. And again, the Americans are not likely to, the Americans are incapable of using weapons of mass destruction on a civilian target. They are always concerned about collateral destruction. So I suspect it would probably be something a lot more restrained. But ways and means vary enormously with the target that they're after. And of course, at this time, they don't even know who or what they're after.
Now, as you well know, after the embassy bombings in Africa, the Americans in the Clinton administration conducted a number of strikes which became very controversial because it appeared that they met with limited success, if any success at all. And there was also a certain degree of controversy in the world of nations about whether or not it had been the appropriate response directed at the right places. Will the United States have to convince the international community of the veracity of its evidence in terms of what it believes happened here today and who was responsible before or immediately after any action it takes?
It'll have to do that. It'll also have to convince the press corps of the veracity of its information. But again, in a situation like this, I think there is a lot of latitude in the international community. In fact, the United States will probably receive far more support than it can handle from other countries, including some countries with whom its relations are not always the best. It may also be that other countries, for example, I could conceivably see the Soviet Union, Russia perhaps, offering, air base for support for operations, or sharing its intelligence with the United States. An attack like this really threatens everybody, because the United States has not been the only target of terrorism. Remember, inside Russia, they had apartment buildings that were being demolished by the guerrillas from the south of the country a couple of years ago. Other countries in the past, Britain and France, have suffered extensively from terrorism that also involved massive explosions. The United States is not going to be the only target, nor is Israel. The other countries will be feeling threatened by attacks of this magnitude. Also, as it were, the bar for terrorism has just been raised. A few years ago, terrorism was a pipe bomb or a time bomb somewhere. Then it became a car bomb, and then in the 1990s it became a truck bomb, and now we've seen sort of what the new standard is. So everyone's going to be alarmed that any terrorist is going to try and emulate the success that's just been demonstrated in New York City.
All right, one last brief point to you. Once the United States does decide on a response, where does Canada fit in?
Well, it's very likely that dozens of Canadians may be among those who've died in New York City today. Canada is going to have to be involved in whatever appropriate responses are recommended. In fact, I think this is probably the best course. At the same time, we will have to cooperate as closely as we can with the Americans to try and make sure that any possible intelligence that could be developed here is passed on to them as timely and quickly as possible.
All right. John Thompson, who's been working with us throughout this day and trying to understand what happened and what may happen now, is with the Mackenzie Institute here in Toronto. We appreciate your time, John. It didn't take long for the shockwaves of the explosion to ripple out beyond Manhattan. Financial markets in the United States, Canada, and Europe closed down for the day as they struggled to deal with the body blow to the center of U.S. finance. Havard Gould reports on the immediate impact on markets and on what could come later.
Through technology and globalization, the world's financial centers are connected as never before. So in response to the attacks in the U.S., towers in Toronto's financial district were emptied.
Not because of any specific threat that I'm aware of, but simply because events, I think, were so extraordinary in the United States that it was decided to simply clear these buildings out as a precaution.
All of the brokerage business and banks are basically shut down, and so we're not moving any money at this point.
The New York stock markets never opened and will remain closed tomorrow. The U.S. Federal Reserve tried to reassure Americans, remaining open to pump money into the banks if needed. But around the globe, where investors could, they pulled money out of markets. London's losses, almost 7%, the steepest in more than a decade. In Canada, exchanges suspended trading mid-morning as losses accelerated.
Our market was off sharply. We were down about 4%.
It isn't clear when the Canadian markets will reopen or what will happen.
We really don't know where things go from here. Markets had to close early. Before they closed, they plunged. Gold is up over $17. Oil prices are up. Who knows what tomorrow will bring? People are very concerned. There's already talk about recession.
A recession avoided up to now only because U.S. consumers have stubbornly kept spending, confidently buying in the face of mounting debt, layoffs, and shutdowns. How they will feel, what they will do after this day, is critical for the North American and global economies.
It's people's attitudes toward world events which can shake the confidence of investors and can shake the attitudes of people.
Canada closes.
Eric Kersner studies consumer and investor behavior.
They're just going to sit tight and not take any action at all. Not going to be spend. Consumer spending is in the short run going to taper right off.
Of the call.
Only when the first shock wears off, when the stock markets get up and running again, will it become clear how much long-term damage has been done to the economies of the United States and the world. Havard Gould, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, let's go back and look live to New York City as night begins to fall on that city after a day like no other. About to be a night, as we say, like no other. Lights on in major parts of the city, but at the southern end of Manhattan, most of that city has been evacuated. The National Guard begins to move in tonight. 10 to 20,000 members of the U.S. National Guard will be moving in to help take over some of the emergency response operations that are going on and simply to patrol the streets. One can only imagine what that must look like down in that end of New York now, where the World Trade Towers used to dominate the skyline just a few hours ago. Gone now, a pile of rubble, an enormous pile of rubble, with the bodies trapped inside of who knows how many people. New York City, September 11th, 2001. The smoke still rising into the night sky. George W. Bush will be speaking now, we're told, at 8:30, about 47 minutes from now. He arrived back in the White House less than an hour ago. It had originally been scheduled for his remarks to the nation to be at 9 o'clock. He has moved that up now until 8:30. Various members of his cabinet have been hitting the airwaves in the last hour to give briefings about the situation, the Defense Department, the Attorney General, Health Services Department, the Transport Department, but the President of the United States. All eyes in that nation and around the world will be on his remarks, coming now in about 3/4 of an hour live from the White House. In this nation, still on tarmacs at airports across this country, planes that have been stranded as a result of the situation in the United States. We've been checking in from coast to coast to coast on that situation. Let's go back now to Halifax, where Paul Withers has been working with us all day on the situation in Halifax, where there are literally dozens of planes that have been laid out on the tarmacs there with passengers stranded. Paul, what's the latest situation there?
Peter, between 7,000 and 8,000 passengers on planes destined for the U.S. are stranded on the tarmac here at Halifax International Airport. There are 44 planes on the tarmac, a giant runway parking lot as we speak, full of 747s, 767s. So far, passengers from 11 planes have been taken off and are being sent to various centers in the Halifax area, sportsplexes, even en route, we understand, to the Halifax Metro Center. The mood of the passengers, as we've been speaking to them as they've been taken off, is of course one of shock, disbelief, some praise for the way the situation's been handled here, happy that they touched down safely. Lately, within the last hour, we've heard that there has been some frustration on board. Airport officials admitting in a briefing not very long ago that some passengers are showing signs of impatience and frustration. The RCMP, which said that it would take about an hour and a half to take each plane, to take the passengers off each plane, have moved that up considerably. They were going to do it one at a time. With 44 planes, that would take it until sometime tomorrow at the very earliest. They've advanced that schedule. Right now, they're getting the passengers off a lot faster than they expected. About 4 planes every hour are being emptied of passengers. They're being sent, as I said, to various centers, sportsplexes, schools in the Halifax area. A lot of the people, by the way, who volunteered to billet some of the Swiss Air families. You may remember the terrible plane crash off Peggy's Cove. Some of the people who volunteered to take in Swiss Air families, volunteering to take in people who have been left stranded here. The situation in Halifax, as probably across the entire country, all airline flight domestically canceled. No idea when domestic flights will resume. No idea when the 7,000 to 8,000 people stranded here in Halifax tonight will finally get on their way to various destinations. No estimation on that. They say it's just too early to say, but they're expecting now that all of the passengers will be off between 3 and 5 a.m. Tomorrow morning, much faster than they originally anticipated. So far, the buses have been rolling all the time here, taking people into the city for who knows how long. They're just scrambling right now, coping with the effects of this terrible disaster as it ripples out to places like Halifax. Peter?
Thanks, Paul. The latest we're told is that it won't be before noon tomorrow before the Americans will start allowing aircraft back into their airspace, so it could be a long wait. You can only imagine the numbers of aircraft in different places just simply around Canada that are waiting to get into the U.S. It's going to be a logistical nightmare to move them back into the States, assuming things open up again at noon. Paul, just one quick last point. Do I understand you correctly that there is space of some sort somewhere for all these people who've landed stranded in Halifax at this hour?
I know. Well, it is our understanding, yes, it's not going to be a hotel space on the Halifax waterfront. It's going to be in schools. It's going to be at the Sackville Sportsplex. It's going to be at the Halifax Exhibition Park, where they have winter fairs and those sort of things. Not deluxe accommodations at all. We have seen some passengers rent cars and try to drive down to Vermont if they can get across the border, I suppose. Good luck to them. But here, as everywhere else, no real answers yet as to what happens next. Just trying to get them off those planes. Peter?
All right, Paul Withers reporting to us tonight in Halifax, and a situation similar to that in many cities across the country tonight, as we heard Terry Malewski reporting from Vancouver and elsewhere, from Calgary. We've had reports Toronto and St. John's as well. One of the terrible figures that we have been tracking throughout this day, we told you, I think, that once those towers had been hit by the hijacked aircraft in New York City, there were fire officials, firefighters, and police officers in the building trying to rescue people to get them out. Obviously, then the buildings fell down, and there are continuing reports of a couple of hundred firefighters missing, and now the New York Police Department says 78 of its officers are missing tonight. Just one of the terrible aspects of what is just a terrible story that will continue to unfold in the days ahead. And unfortunately, I'm very sorry to report that we are going to be hearing some awfully big numbers starting probably early tomorrow morning when some of the indications become clear as to just how many people were inside those towers and the buildings next to the towers that have since fallen in New York City as a result of these hijacked aircraft being slammed into the two towers of the World Trade Center. That's not even to mention yet in Washington as well, where another airliner slammed into the Pentagon building, and it's assumed there are many dead there as well. Nobody venturing figures at this point. The U.S. Defense Secretary only saying that the number is not a few. Well, as word of the attack started spreading, Canadians stopped in their tracks to take it all in. They crowded in front of televisions and public areas. They pulled out cell phones and let others know. And all the while, they struggled to understand how and why this could have happened. Norman Hermant now with the horror and disbelief felt throughout this country.
Across Canada, people watch the unthinkable unfold across the border. As news of the enormity of what happened sunk in, office towers in Toronto started to empty.
It's a terrible tragedy. We have someone there at the World Trade Center this morning at a conference, and we haven't heard from him. And we're just going over to our other office to be with our other fellow employees. We're just too devastated right now.
It's scary. I'm scared, I'll be quite honest with you. And I just called my wife a few minutes ago and said we're heading home, and she's very happy about that.
No matter where people were, the reaction seemed to be the same: disbelief.
It's like a movie. It's not real.
It's like you're watching a movie, you know?
It's insane. It's just like a movie. It isn't. It's actually surreal to me to see it on TV and see major buildings collapse.
Not long after the attacks, U.S. consulates across the country closed.
Just to give you appointment.
For many people, there was sympathy for a country so tightly connected to Canada.
For all the people who have died, please bless them, Lord, and their families.
In Saskatoon, there were prayers from these students and questions about what comes next.
It's just so incredible that it's out of nowhere. Nobody saw this coming, and so much has happened in, like, I don't know, 3-hour time period or something. What's going to happen in the next week or 2 weeks? Like, what the United States is going to do? What if people are actually going to admit that they were the ones who did it and why they did it?
That question was asked more than any other. Why?
I just wish there wasn't that hate. Because that's a problem.
The problem for many people now, dealing with the devastation so close to home. Norman Hermant, CBC News, Toronto.
As we mentioned earlier, soon after the carnage began, the call for help was raised and sent north to this country. And as Matthew Pace reports, Canadians everywhere were quick to answer it.
Canadians line up to help victims of a violence almost impossible to believe, giving blood in Vancouver.
Today we've had an unbelievable response from our donors.
In Ottawa.
Horrified. It felt like you're looking at a movie, but it's obviously not.
All across the country, help for victims who are not that far away.
There's going to be a need for immediate care and comfort. These people have obviously suffered tremendous shocks to their system.
Canadian emergency crews are already preparing to go to the U.S. as soon as they get the call.
The first and foremost thing that we'll look at is whether we can offer any assistance in the healthcare field, because the priority becomes on the living.
That will direct the operation on a national level.
The Red Cross is coordinating much of the relief effort.
Tracing service, can I help you?
Helping Canadians find American friends and relatives who may have been hurt.
They're seeing the same things that we are, all the destruction that's happening, and they really want to know, are their family members involved? Are they hurt? Can they help them?
Relief workers are on standby to do whatever they're asked to do.
Coordination is the key thing. The important thing in terms of help coming in from the outside is that it comes through the appropriate channels and that they coordinate that.
A relief effort that's only just begun. Matthew Pace, CBC News, Montreal.
Well, this is obviously a story that we're going to be following right through the night, and I just want to keep you warned of that we are staying on throughout this night And we will have live coverage of any of the events that take place this evening in terms of briefings and analysis from various parts, not only of this country and the United States, but anywhere in the world. So don't leave us if you're trying to follow this story, try to understand what happened and what may happen next. Let's go to Washington, where Henry Champ is standing by in our bureau in the American Capitol. Henry, the U.S. President now scheduled to speak at 8:30 this evening. We've seen a phalanx of his cabinet ministers out in the past hour and a half or so to try and reassure the American people that they now have things well under control. Given what they've said, what should we expect the U.S. President to be saying in 40 minutes' time, 35 minutes' time from now?
Well, certainly the issue of control and that the government has got matters under control at the moment is the key one. Unity among the people, a call for unity, which will be responded to. We've seen evidence of that from Capitol Hill, where bipartisan leadership of Congress held a press conference earlier this evening, no question about that. A call for prayer and solace and sympathy and assistance to those who've suffered in this particular incident. And as you've said, those numbers are going to be quite high. And then I think, and what will be most important, is a clear indication to the American people that no stone unturned to find these people, and that if they're found, they will be punished. And you already hear a lot of leadership calls from around the country, whether it's from mayors of big cities, whether it's from people on Capitol Hill, talk of retaliation against nations that shelter or hide terrorists, things of that kind. And the blood is up, and the president will probably respond to that feeling.
Now, as far as we know, his major meeting today with other senior cabinet officials, one would assume the defense secretary, the secretary of state, was this teleconference call that took place while he was in Nebraska. Now, there have been a number of people commenting on our broadcast throughout this day that the voice of Colin Powell has to be heard here and very closely by George Bush, suggesting that perhaps Powell is I was going to say the voice of moderation. I don't think that's the right word to use here, but a more calm and reasoned voice at a time of a major crisis like this. Powell was in South America. He's on his way back now. Your sense of this, because as someone who knows that scene, especially the State Department scene, having covered it so closely over many years, Powell's role in what is likely to happen next, how do you see that unfolding?
I think it's going to be excruciatingly important. First of all, when you look at the cabinet of the Bush government, Powell is the one with the most foreign experience, coupled with, of course, the most military experience. It's true that Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense before, as was Dick Cheney, but Powell also has that experience, and coupled with that, the support of the people. He is clearly the most popular, the most visible of all people within the cabinet. What Colin Powell says in these next few days will be of paramount importance to the president. Undoubtedly, he'll support the president, but what he'll be saying in quiet council, I'm sure, is an issue of temperance. Powell, throughout his military career, has never been one to fire off the cannons without making sure that the target was the right one, and I'm sure that that's what he'll argue for now. There is a feeling, as I said earlier, that the blood is up in the United States. There's no question about that. These pictures have angered everybody from one end of the country to the other. But it is important, and I'm sure Powell will be a leader of the faction, to make sure that whoever is identified as responsible for these incidents be dealt with responsibly, and if countries are involved, they be dealt with responsibly as well.
All right, Henry Champ with us from Washington, and will be continuing to be with us as we prepare for these crucial remarks from George Bush. Henry, the sense in terms of international crises that this administration has had to handle, I guess the major one that directly involved the United States was the whole incident of the U.S. spy plane that came down in China, and it took whatever number of days before the crew of that aircraft was released. There was a lot of discussion about how the administration handled that, who had the strong voices of influence on the president at that time, and I'm wondering if there's anything we can learn from what happened during that period of time that we should keep in mind tonight as we're about to see the president speak on this one.
Well, you know, it's a good thing that you reminded me about that. I hadn't thought of that, but the fact of the matter is Colin Powell was a lead hand in that negotiation, in principle because at that time he argued successfully that the lead negotiation should be conducted by the embassies in the region. And if you recall, it was the ambassador to China from the United States who played a significant role in the eventual successful end to what could have been a very difficult political issue. The same applies to the Middle East, where Powell has been very forthright in making sure that ambassadors, people with career responsibility and history, are the ones who make the key decisions, or at least report back to the president their messages unfiltered. And I think that will be the kind of role that he'll play here, too, is to make sure that those who are the true knowledgeable individuals in the world of terrorism and things of that kind will go forward. I think, too, when we're looking at all of this, George Tenet at the